The call came in at 3 minutes past 2 in the morning. By the time the first patrol unit reached the overpass near the Eastern Freight Corridor, the body was already cold. If you think you know what happened here, pause for a moment. Listen carefully. Because this case did not begin with a scream, or a struggle, or even a witness. It began with silence, and a pair of shoes placed neatly beside a guardrail. Detective Rachel Monroe arrived 17 minutes after the initial dispatch. The city was still half asleep, sodium lights flickering over empty lanes of asphalt. A stalled truck idled 50 yards away, its driver smoking with both hands shaking, claiming he never saw anyone jump, only something falling. Rachel stepped beneath the overpass without speaking. Denim jacket, dark crop top, fitted denims, army boots scraping grit against concrete. Her posture was controlled, but there was a tightening at the jaw that only those who knew her well would notice. The victim lay below the guardrail on the gravel slope between the road and the railway tracks. Male, late 20s. Severe blunt force trauma consistent with a fall from height. No identification in the pockets. No wallet. No phone. And yet, the shoes above were aligned heel-toe, toes pointed toward the drop. It looked staged. Roland would later reconstruct the timeline this way. At approximately 1:57 in the morning, a freight engineer reported seeing a silhouette standing on the overpass railing as his train approached. He assumed it was a maintenance worker. The train did not slow. By the time it passed beneath, the silhouette was gone. At 2 minutes past 2, a truck driver reported an object striking the gravel shoulder. At 3 minutes past 2, emergency services received the first call. There were no other reports. No argument. No distress. No witnesses. Rachel crouched beside the body. The victim's right wrist bore faint ligature impressions. Not deep enough to indicate prolonged restraint. Just enough to suggest pressure. Suicides do not bind their own wrists. She scanned the slope. No drag marks. No secondary footprints. Only the impact site and scattered gravel displaced outward like a broken halo. Above, the guardrail stood waist high, metal chipped with age. No obvious blood transfer. One direction. She asked quietly. Light cross breeze from the west. The patrol officer replied. That mattered. If someone had pushed him, the arc of descent would shift. Rachel mentally traced the trajectory from rail to gravel. The body had landed slightly inward, not outward. That detail would become important later. For now, there was something else. The victim's hands were clean. Not washed clean, untouched. Fingernails short. No embedded debris. No defensive scratches. No fibers. As if he had never fought, Rachel stood and walked back up the incline to the overpass. The shoes were men's, size unknown at first glance, leather casuals, moderately worn. Inside the left shoe was a folded scrap of paper. No note. Just a printed train schedule. Specifically, the freight line running beneath this overpass. Highlighted in yellow was the 2 o'clock eastbound cargo line. Not the one that passed at 1:57. A different train entirely. Rachel stared at the timestamp on the schedule. It had been printed earlier that evening. Whoever placed those shoes expected a different train to pass, which meant the fall was mistimed, or interrupted. She straightened slowly. Secure the perimeter, she said. I want every camera within a half-mile radius pulled. Traffic. Private businesses. Rail authority. Everything. The patrol officer hesitated. You think this isn't a jumper? Rachel did not answer directly. Instead, she looked back down at the body. The victim's head was angled unnaturally toward the tracks. His eyes were open. There was dirt beneath his collar. Not from the slope. From somewhere else. Roland would later describe this moment as the fracture point. The instant the narrative of suicide began to collapse under its own symmetry. Because symmetry is rarely accidental. The shoes aligned. The schedule folded. The timing highlighted. But no note. No phone. No identification. And faint marks at the wrist. Rachel requested forensics to preserve the railing for latent prints and trace. She then walked the length of the overpass alone, counting steps beneath her breath. From the midpoint to the shoes was 12 paces. From the shoes to the centerline was 4. No scuffing, no heel drag, no panic pivot. If a man climbed voluntarily, there would be hesitation. Shifted gravel, micro slips near the base of the rail. Here, the dust layer was undisturbed, except for one partial tread near the far edge, not near the shoes. A second person's stance. Rachel crouched again. The tread was incomplete but heavier. Wider pattern. She exhaled slowly. 2 people, she said to herself. Below, the freight tracks vibrated faintly as another train approached in the distance. The hum grew steadily louder. Rachel stepped back from the rail. The highlighted schedule had anticipated a different train. Why? If someone intended to stage a suicide beneath a passing train for maximum spectacle, they would time it precisely. Instead, the victim fell minutes before the highlighted train. Unless he was meant to be found later. Unless the wrong train arrived first. A patrol officer approached carefully. Detective, rail control says the 2 o'clock eastbound was delayed. Mechanical issue. It passed at 2:16. Rachel looked at him. 2:16. The highlighted train. Which meant when the silhouette was seen at 1:57, it was not aligned with the marked schedule. Which meant the person on the rail either did not know about the delay or was not planning to jump at that time. She stared down at the slope again. If the plan involved a moving train at 2:16, then a body falling at 1:57 suggests interruption or resistance. But there were no defensive wounds, unless the victim had been restrained beforehand. She turned toward the access stairwell descending from the overpass. Metal steps. Paint chipped. Rusted bolts. Halfway down, there was a smear along the inner railing. Not blood. Mud. Fresh. Rachel followed the smear downward. At the base of the stairs was a narrow service path leading toward an abandoned warehouse adjacent to the rail yard. The mud trail continued in faint impressions. 2 sets. One slightly dragging. Roland would later say that criminals often believe in theatrical clarity. They over-design the scene above and forget the transitional spaces below. The overpass had been staged. The stairs had not. Rachel keyed her radio. Extend perimeter to the adjacent warehouse property. I want entry cleared. The warehouse stood silent, windows blackened with age and grime, one loading door partially ajar. Inside, the air smelled of oil and dust, and something metallic. Rachel entered with 2 uniformed officers. The floor bore recent disturbance. A chair overturned. Zip ties scattered near a support column. On the column itself, fibers. Synthetic. Consistent with restraint. The ligature impressions on the victim's wrist had not been accidental. He had been held here. Rachel scanned the interior slowly. On a makeshift table lay a laptop. Closed. No visible power. Beside it, a second train schedule. This one circled in pen at 2:16. And beneath that, a handwritten note. Make it look clean. No signature. No explanation. Just instruction. Rachel felt the familiar tightening in her chest. Not fear, not adrenaline. Recognition. This was not impulsive violence. This was choreography. And somewhere between the warehouse and the rail, something disrupted the timing. She turned toward the officers. Photograph everything. Bag the ties. Dust the laptop. I want rail control logs, delay reports, and maintenance communications pulled immediately. She paused. And find out who printed these schedules tonight. Because someone had prepared for a train that arrived late. And someone else had been watching the wrong clock. The body beneath the overpass was not meant to fall at 1:57. It was meant to disappear at 2:16, which meant whoever staged this believed they had more time. Time they did not have. As dawn began to dilute the darkness beyond the warehouse windows, Rachel stepped back outside. The city was waking now, traffic beginning to murmur in the distance. Reporters would arrive soon. The narrative would attempt to simplify. Young man. Late night. Tragic decision. But Rachel knew better. The wrists told one story. The shoes told another. And the delayed train told a third. 3 fractures in a scene that was supposed to be seamless. She looked once more toward the overpass. Somewhere between 1:57 and 3 minutes past 2, the plan had shifted. And the person who shifted it was still out there. Watching. Waiting to see whether the death would be labeled suicide or something far more deliberate. This was not a man who jumped. This was a man who was positioned. And the positioning had failed. Block 1 ends not with answers, but with a clock running backward. Because when staging collapses under mistimed precision, it reveals something else entirely: intent interrupted. And interruption always leaves a witness. even if that witness does not yet know they saw something important. If you follow evidence over assumptions, subscribe now. And tell me in the comments, based on what you've heard so far, does the timeline feel intentional or accidental? By 6:45 in the morning, the overpass was cleared of patrol vehicles. The body had been transported. The warehouse sealed. The freight line resumed normal operations. But something had shifted. Rachel Monroe stood inside the Rail Authority's regional control room just after 8. Rows of monitors flickered with live track feeds and archived playback windows. Coffee cups, fluorescent glare, a low hum of systems that never truly powered down. The supervisor, a narrow-shouldered man with permanent worry etched across his brow, replayed the 157 train passage for the third time. "There," he said, pausing the frame. A silhouette on the railing, balanced, still. Rachel stepped closer to the screen. Zoom. The image pixelated but not beyond recognition. The figure's posture was rigid, not leaning forward, not wavering, not someone preparing to jump, someone being held steady. "Run the seconds before that," Rachel said. Playback resumed. At 1:56 and 20 seconds, the figure was not alone. A second shape moved behind it, partially obscured by the guardrail beam. Then the train thundered through, briefly blocking the camera's line of sight. When visibility returned, the silhouette was gone. The supervisor swallowed. "I didn't notice the second one earlier." "You weren't looking for it," Rachel replied. "Because at first glance, this was meant to be simple. A single shadow, a single fall, a single explanation. But shadows overlap when two people stand too close." Rachel requested every camera angle covering the service path, stairwell, and warehouse perimeter. Most were outdated. Several pointed at empty gravel. One, however, faced the far end of the warehouse yard, a blind corner near stacked shipping pallets. At 1:51 in the morning, headlights briefly illuminated that corner. A dark sedan reversed into frame. No plates visible. Engine idled for 38 seconds. Then shut off. No one exited on camera, but at 1:55, two figures emerged from the warehouse's side entrance. One walking upright, the other gagged, not dragged violently. Escorted. Rachel leaned forward. "Freeze it." The guided figure's hands were behind his back. Wrists likely bound, head lowered. No visible struggle. Advance frame by frame. At 1:56 and 9 seconds, the upright figure adjusted grip at the elbow. At 1:56 and 15 seconds, both moved toward the stairwell. By 1:57, they were out of view. Rachel's jaw tightened slightly. No impulsive act. No emotional collapse. This was transfer. She turned to the supervisor. "When was that warehouse last rented?" He tapped at a terminal. "Technically not rented. Properties in foreclosure. No registered tenant for 6 months." Which meant access was either forced or arranged privately. Rachel requested property access logs, electricity records, water usage, because empty buildings rarely remain truly empty. Back at the precinct, preliminary autopsy findings arrived just before 11. Roland would later describe the report as quiet but decisive. Cause of death: blunt force trauma from fall. Pre-fall injuries: minor bruising at rib cage consistent with restraint pressure. No defensive wounds. No drugs in preliminary toxicology screen. Time of death estimated between 1:58 and 2 minutes past 2. The delayed train had passed at 2:16, meaning the victim had not been struck by it, meaning the highlighted schedule was not about impact. It was about noise. A freight train at full speed would drown out a scream. Rachel stared at the report. If the plan had proceeded as scheduled, the fall would have coincided with the passing train at 2:16. The sound would mask the event. The body discovered later. Context shaped by the aligned shoes and printed schedule. A suicide narrative built around misdirection. But the earlier train disrupted that choreography. Either the perpetrator miscalculated the delay, or the victim resisted at the wrong second. Rachel returned to the warehouse in early afternoon with a forensic team. Daylight revealed details missed under sodium lamps. The overturned chair bore scuff marks on the legs. Recent. On the concrete floor beneath it, a faint circular indentation suggested it had been placed deliberately before being kicked. The zip ties recovered near the support column were standard hardware store grade, but one tie had been partially cut. Not snap, cut, which meant someone had attempted to free themselves. Rachel traced the mud trail again. This time, in daylight, she noticed something subtle. The dragging pattern was intermittent, as if the victim had been allowed to walk for stretches. Encouraged compliance. Perhaps promised something. She stepped outside to the pallet corner where the sedan had idled. Tire impressions were shallow but visible in the soft earth. Forensics cast them carefully. The width suggested a mid-size vehicle. Common, not helpful, unless matched later. Rachel stood still for a moment, reconstructing. Warehouse restraint. Escort to stairwell. Pause at railing. Unexpected train at 1:57. Decision point. Push early. Because waiting would increase risk of visibility. Because the earlier train illuminated the overpass from below, and illumination exposes faces. She inhaled slowly. Whoever orchestrated this had planned for silence. They had not planned for interruption. Back at her desk, Rachel began building the timeline in written form, not as bullet fragments, but as narrative flow. 1:51 vehicle arrival. 1:55 two individuals exit warehouse. 1:56 ascent. 1:57 premature train arrival. Between 1:57 and 2 minutes past 2 fall. 3 minutes past 2 emergency call. She circled one detail in her notes. The emergency call. The truck driver claimed he saw something fall, but he did not report seeing two figures. Only one object descending. Rachel requested the call recording. She listened twice. The driver's voice trembled, but there was a pause before he mentioned the fall, a pause long enough to consider wording. "Did you see anyone else on the bridge?" The dispatcher had asked. "No. Just the guy." No hesitation on that answer. Rachel replayed the video of the silhouette. There had been two figures seconds before the train passed. If the truck driver approached after the fall, he might not have seen the second person. Unless the second person remained visible for a moment. Unless they did not flee immediately. Rachel checked traffic camera timestamps along the adjacent road. At 2 minutes past 2, a dark sedan merged onto the eastbound lane 2 blocks from the overpass. The same general body shape as the warehouse vehicle. But the footage was grainy. License plate unreadable. Still, the timing aligned almost perfectly with the emergency call, which meant the perpetrator may have remained nearby until confirmation. Confirmation that the body had fallen. Confirmation that the narrative would hold. Rachel leaned back in her chair. There was something controlled about this. Too controlled. No personal message. No emotional overkill. Just precision. And precision suggests motive beyond impulse. She opened missing persons reports from the previous 48 hours. Nothing immediate. She then cross-referenced local arrest records involving the rail yard in recent months. 2 minor trespassing citations. 1 dismissed. Nothing violent. Then she did something quieter. She searched recent civil disputes involving properties adjacent to the freight corridor. And there it was. An ongoing legal battle over redevelopment rights of several warehouse parcels, including the abandoned structure where the victim had been restrained. 3 corporate entities. 2 investors. 1 arbitration hearing scheduled for later this week. Rachel did not jump to conclusions. But land near rail corridors becomes valuable when rezoned. And accidents, especially those involving safety concerns, can delay redevelopment. If a suicide occurred on that overpass, scrutiny would fall on rail authority infrastructure. Delays. Investigations. Insurance complications. Rachel closed the file. Speculation for now, but motive rarely hides far from money. She glanced at the clock. 4:30 in the afternoon. The victim still unidentified. No wallet. No phone. Which meant someone either removed them before staging, or the victim had been lured without them. She returned to the warehouse evidence list. Laptop recovered. Power cord present. No visible external damage. If powered, it might reveal planning. Rachel instructed digital forensics to prioritize extraction. As evening settled over the city, she drove back to the overpass alone. The traffic was steady now. Commuters. Horns. Impatience. She stood at the same railing where the silhouette had been captured hours earlier. In daylight, the guardrail seemed less dramatic, less theatrical, but she could still feel the geometry of it. Where the second person stood, where hands would grip elbows, where a decision compressed into seconds. She placed her palms lightly against the metal. Cold, solid, stable. No accidental slip here. If someone went over, they were directed. Rachel stepped back and scanned the horizon. Somewhere, the person who executed this plan believed it was nearly flawless. They accounted for sound, for staging, for misdirection. But they failed to account for delay, and delay exposed them to a camera that caught a second shadow. Two figures on a rail designed for one narrative. Block two ends with clarity sharpening, not softening. Because the question is no longer whether this was staged. The question is who benefits from a death time to a freight schedule, and why the clock mattered more than the man who fell. The victim received a name at 9:12 the following morning. It came not from missing persons, not from fingerprints in any criminal database, but from a transit access card found wedged inside the lining of his jacket collar during secondary forensic processing. The card had been overlooked at first. Thin, flexible, nearly invisible against the seam. Registered to Arjun Mehta, age 29. Occupation junior structural analyst at a private engineering consultancy. Rachel read the profile twice. Structural analyst. Her eyes lifted slowly. Rail corridor redevelopment. Warehouse rezoning dispute. A structural analyst employed in the same city where a contested industrial parcel bordered an active freight line. Coincidence is common, but convergence is not. She requested Arjun Mehta's employment records immediately. By late morning, she was seated across from the managing director of Mehta's firm, a glass, walled office overlooking a construction site mid-demolition. He didn't show up yesterday, the director said carefully. But that's not unusual. Analysts often work remotely. Was he assigned to any rail, adjacent projects? Rachel asked. A flicker. Brief. Subtle. Yes. Preliminary stress modeling for proposed overpass reinforcement near the Eastern Freight Corridor. The same overpass. Rachel kept her expression neutral. What was his assessment? The director hesitated again. He raised concerns. What kind of concerns? That the current guardrail configuration was not compliant with updated fall prevention codes if pedestrian access increased after redevelopment. Rachel leaned back slightly. So the rail was considered structurally insufficient. Under projected foot traffic loads, yes. And was that report finalized? I was under internal review, which meant it had not yet been submitted publicly. Rachel's mind began assembling the pieces. If Arjun Mehta's report indicated structural inadequacy, redevelopment could be delayed. Funding impacted, permits reconsidered, insurance premiums adjusted. And if a suicide occurred before the report surfaced, public pressure might shift narrative toward personal tragedy rather than infrastructure negligence. Unless someone needed that report suppressed entirely. Who else had access to his draft findings? Rachel asked. Project partners. 2 external development firms. Legal oversight. Standard chain. Rachel noted the names. One matched the corporate entity locked in arbitration over the abandoned warehouse. Now the convergence sharpened. Back at the precinct, digital forensics powered the recovered laptop from the warehouse using an isolated environment. Encrypted, but not professionally hardened. Within hours, access was gained. The desktop revealed folders labeled by date. One file stood alone on the home screen. Final impact model revised. Timestamp earlier that evening. Rachel opened it. Inside were simulation renders of the overpass under dynamic load conditions. The highlighted conclusion. Under certain applied lateral force conditions, the guardrail would fail below regulatory threshold. But that was not the most significant finding. In the revision notes section, Arjun had added a paragraph. Observed evidence of recent microfracture stress along mid-span support bracket. Potential prior impact or tampering cannot be ruled out. Rachel stared at that line. Tampering. If the rail had been weakened intentionally, a staged suicide could be reframed as accidental infrastructure failure, which would trigger regulatory shutdown, which would halt redevelopment, which would shift liability. She exhaled slowly, but the guardrail had not failed. The victim had gone over intact, which meant the tampering, if real, had not been required, unless the plan evolved. Unless Arjun discovered something he was not meant to discover. She scrolled further. Email drafts. One unsent addressed to Municipal Safety Board. Subject line: urgent structural integrity concern. Body incomplete. I believe the overpass reinforcement schedule may conceal. The sentence ended there. No continuation. No send record. Rachel's gaze hardened. Arjun had intended to report something. Instead, he was restrained in a warehouse, escorted to the very structure he questioned, and positioned on a rail his own analysis deemed vulnerable. The staging was no longer random. It was symbolic. Make it look clean. The handwritten note found on the warehouse table echoed in her mind. Clean did not just mean tidy. It meant simple. A suicide eliminates liability. A suicide discredits the analyst. A suicide buries the draft report beneath personal narrative. Rachel requested Arjun's phone metadata from the carrier. Though the device itself was missing, location pings would reveal movement patterns. By mid-afternoon, data returned. His last active signal originated near the warehouse at 1:40, 8 in the morning. Before that, his apartment. No unusual detours, no bar stops, no social visits, which meant he had likely been intercepted deliberately. Rachel drove to Arjun's apartment, modest, third-floor unit. Engineering textbooks stacked neatly beside a drafting table. On the desk was a printed copy of the same impact model found on the warehouse laptop. Except this version included additional handwritten annotations. Bracket bolts show non-uniform torque pattern. Access ladder shows tool scoring. Unauthorized maintenance. Rachel photographed each note carefully. Someone had accessed the overpass structure recently. Not for reinforcement. For something else. Rachel stepped onto the small balcony of the apartment. From there, faintly visible in the distance, was the freight corridor skyline. Arjun had been thinking about that overpass long before he stood upon it, and perhaps long before someone else realized he had noticed too much. She returned to the precinct and overlaid 3 timelines Arjun's report revisions. Corporate arbitration schedule. Warehouse vehicle appearance. The arbitration hearing was scheduled for 2 days from now. If Arjun's report had been submitted publicly before that hearing, arguments about safety compliance could disrupt proceedings. But if he died, tragically, publicly, the focus would shift. And if his report never surfaced, concerns about structural integrity might be dismissed as incomplete speculation. Rachel contacted the Municipal Safety Board. No formal submission from Arjun had been received, which meant the draft existed only on his devices. 1 recovered. 1 missing. The missing phone could contain evidence of who contacted him last. She reviewed the call log metadata. Last incoming call at 1:37 in the morning. Unknown number. Duration 1 minute and 12 seconds. After that, phone movement toward warehouse area. Rachel requested subscriber information for that number. The record traced back to a prepaid device purchased 2 weeks earlier. No registered owner. Disposable. She closed her eyes briefly. Planned. Layered. Timed. But still flawed. Because the early freight train had arrived before expected. Because a second shadow appeared on camera. Because Arjun had written more than he likely realized. Rachel stood and walked to the evidence board, though she avoided fragmenting the case into dramatic shorthand. Instead, she spoke aloud softly as Roland would later reconstruct in narrative form. Arjun meta-questioned structural integrity. He documented irregular torque patterns. He drafted a safety alert. He received a late-night call. He traveled toward the warehouse. He was restrained. He was escorted to the overpass. A train arrived earlier than expected. He fell. Shoes aligned. Schedule highlighted. Make it look clean. Clean removes context. Clean removes motive. Clean removes profit trails. But interruption leaves residue. The residue was now accumulating. Rachel glanced at the clock. 7 in the evening. She had 1 more step before the day ended. She returned to the overpass a 3rd time. This time with a structural engineer from the city's independent review panel. Together they examined the mid-span bracket Arjun had referenced. Under closer inspection, faint tool scoring was visible around bolt heads. Non-standard wear, as if tightened or loosened outside scheduled maintenance. The engineer frowned. This wasn't routine adjustment. Could it weaken the rail? Rachel asked. Temporarily. Or create perceived instability? Rachel stepped back. If someone wanted to simulate structural failure under specific load conditions, they could adjust torque to create vulnerability. But the rail had not failed. Arjun had. Which meant perhaps the rail was never the primary target. Perhaps Arjun was. Because an engineer raising safety alarms becomes inconvenient in a high-stakes property dispute. Silencing him while framing his death as personal tragedy achieves multiple objectives. Rachel looked down at the tracks below. Another freight train passed beneath them, loud enough to drown conversation entirely. She imagined the original plan. Wait for 216. Position him. Push during peak noise. Leave shoes aligned. Let morning headlines write themselves. But instead, an earlier train forced acceleration. Forced imperfection. And imperfection created shadow. Block 3 closes with the victim no longer anonymous. Arjun Mehta did not jump. He analyzed. He questioned. He documented. And somewhere between documentation and disclosure, someone decided his calculations were more dangerous than the overpass itself. The clock is no longer just about trains. It is about who knew the delay schedule and who did not. Because timing errors expose hierarchy, and hierarchy leads to names. Hierarchy reveals itself in who has access to timing. Not public schedules, not commuter apps, but internal delay reports. At 9:15 the next morning, Rachel sat across from the regional operations coordinator for the freight authority, a composed woman in her early 40s who kept her answers measured and precise. Who knew about the 216 delay before it was announced? Rachel asked. It was logged internally at 1:38 in the morning. The coordinator replied. Mechanical inspection triggered at the previous junction. Who receives automatic delay notifications? Dispatch supervisors. Maintenance leads. Partner redevelopment liaisons with active safety oversight agreements. Rachel wrote down the last phrase. Partner redevelopment liaisons. How many entities hold that designation? 3. Rachel already knew 2 of them from the arbitration file. The third surprised her. A private infrastructure consulting firm contracted to evaluate long-term corridor modernization. She asked for the notification log. At 1:38 in the morning, delay alert transmitted to 9 internal recipients and 3 external liaisons. One of the external addresses matched a senior project director at the same development firm currently contesting warehouse redevelopment rights. The firm, whose parcel bordered the abandoned structure. Rachel requested confirmation of receipt timestamps. One external address opened the alert at 1:42, another at 1:47, the third at 1:53. The silhouette on the overpass was captured at 1:57, which meant at least one external liaison had knowledge of the delay before Arjun was escorted up the stairwell. If the original plan relied on a 216 train masking the fall, but someone knew that train was delayed, pushing at 1:57 would become necessary to avoid exposure under brighter, quieter conditions later. Rachel leaned back. Who is the liaison who opened the alert at 1:42? She asked. The coordinator checked. Name: Vikram Sethi, Senior Project Director. Rachel recognized it immediately. Vikram Sethi had been scheduled to testify in arbitration regarding safety compliance standards 2 days from now. She thanked the coordinator and left without further comment. Back at the precinct, she pulled Sethi's background, engineering degree, transitioned into development finance, reputation meticulous, strategic, never publicly controversial, but deeply embedded in corridor redevelopment negotiations. Rachel overlaid phone metadata again. Arjun's last call at 1:37. Delay alert at 1:38. Sethi opened the alert at 1:42. If Sethi had orchestrated the warehouse restraint earlier the night, the delay notification would force recalibration. Push early. Avoid waiting for a train that would now arrive nearly 15 minutes late. 15 minutes is a lifetime on an exposed overpass. Rachel requested cell tower pings for Sethi's registered device between midnight and 3 in the morning. By late afternoon, the data returned. Device location at midnight registered home address. At 1:20, 2 signal shift toward eastern corridor. At 1:49, tower ping consistent with warehouse vicinity. At 2 minutes past 2 movement eastbound along freight access road. At 2:20, 1 device reconnects near residential zone. She stared at the map quietly. The timing aligned too cleanly. But alignment alone is not proof. She needed contact. She requested an interview under the pretense of clarifying infrastructure oversight processes. Sethi arrived at the precinct just before 6 in the evening. Immaculate suit. Measured posture. Eyes that scanned the room before settling. "Detective," he said calmly. Rachel did not waste time. "You received a delay alert at 1:40. 2 in the morning?" she began. "I did." "Were you awake?" "I often monitor overnight developments. Redevelopment zones carry liability." "Where were you at that time?" "Ate home." "Your device places you near the eastern corridor at 1:49. A pause. "Small. Controlled. I may have stepped out briefly. Could not sleep." Rachel observed his breathing. "Stable. Do you know Arjun Mehta?" "Yes. Junior analyst on the reinforcement assessment." "When did you last speak with him?" "Earlier yesterday afternoon regarding modeling revisions." "Did you contact him at 1:30, 7 in the morning?" "No." Rachel watched his eyes. No overt flinch, but a slight tightening around the jaw. His phone records show a 1-minute call from a prepaid number at that time. Rachel continued. He then traveled toward the warehouse. Sethi folded his hands neatly. "I cannot comment on anonymous calls." "Were you aware he drafted an unsent safety alert?" "I was aware he was still refining his conclusions." "Refining or escalating?" Silence. "Measured, detective," Sethi said evenly. "Our firm adheres strictly to compliance. If there were concerns, they would be handled internally before public dissemination." "Internally?" Rachel held his gaze. "Were you inside the abandoned warehouse last night?" "No." "Were you on the overpass?" "No." She did not press further. "Not yet, because confrontation without corroboration fractures cases." Instead, she pivoted. "You opened the delay notification at 1:42, she said. "Did you inform anyone of the revised schedule?" "I forwarded it to our internal risk team." "At what time?" "Approximately 1:45. Rachel noted it. Forwarding logs would confirm. If internal risk personnel then communicated with field actors, timing compression would follow. She ended the interview without accusation. Sethi left as composed as he arrived. But composure is not immunity. Back in her office, Rachel reviewed the warehouse laptop again. In a hidden system folder, recently deleted files had been partially recovered. One image stood out. A photograph of the overpass railing taken from below earlier that week. Timestamp embedded. The angle suggested someone standing on freight ballast directly beneath the mid-span bracket. Zoom toward bolt heads. Tool scoring visible even at that resolution. The metadata included GPS coordinates. Not Arjun's device. Another device entirely. Rachel traced the embedded identifier. Registered to a corporate, issued phone belonging to Vikram Sethi. She did not move for several seconds. Because this was no longer circumstantial presence. This was physical documentation of structural tampering. And that documentation existed on the laptop found inside the warehouse where Arjun had been restrained. Which meant either Arjun had received it, or someone had accessed Sethi's device and transferred it. Rachel checked file creation timestamps. The image was copied onto the laptop at 11:14 the previous night, before the restraint, which suggested Arjun may have confronted someone with evidence, or someone had accessed his device during captivity to remove files and missed this one. She stood and walked to the window overlooking the city. Night had settled again. Another freight train passed faintly in the distance. Rhythmic, unaware, she reconstructed silently. Arjun identifies torque irregularities. Sethi documents bracket condition personally. Delay notification received. Prepaid call placed. Warehouse restraint initiated. Escort to overpass. Earlier train arrives. Push accelerated. Shoes aligned. Schedule planted. Make it look clean. But clean requires total control, and total control rarely survives compressed time. Rachel returned to her desk and requested immediate warrant authorization for Sethi's device's vehicle and property access logs, because the image alone, tied to the warehouse laptop, established probable cause. Before leaving for the night, she drove once more to the overpass. Not out of habit. Out of alignment. She stood at the railing as another train roared beneath. The vibration traveled through metal into bone. She imagined the intended moment at 2:16. Noise swallowing everything. No witness hearing impact, no deviation. But at 1:57, interruption forced improvisation. Improvisation creates error. Error creates trace. And trace creates consequence. Block 4 closes with hierarchy narrowing. The question is no longer whether Arjun Mehta was silenced. The question is whether Vikram Sethi acted alone. Because someone had to restrain, someone had to drive, and someone had to stand behind a man on a rail and decide that timing mattered more than life. The warrant was signed at 8:20 the following morning. By 9:10, Rachel Monroe stood outside Vikram Sethi's residence with a search team. The house was modern. Clean lines, reinforced glass, security cameras mounted at calculated angles. Not ostentatious, strategic. Sethi opened the door himself. He did not look surprised. "Detective," he said evenly. "I assume this is about yesterday." "It is," Rachel replied. "We have a warrant." He stepped aside without argument. That alone was telling. Inside, the home was immaculate. Minimal clutter. Surfaces wiped to sterile sheen. A life curated for control. Forensics moved methodically. Primary devices were collected first: corporate phone, personal phone, laptop, external drives. Rachel walked the perimeter quietly. In the study, framed architectural renderings of redevelopment proposals lined the walls, including the Eastern Freight Corridor transformation plan. The overpass was featured prominently in one concept image. Pedestrian walkway expanded. Glass railing installed. Branded commercial frontage below. Investment projections printed in the corner. Projected increase in land value substantial. Rachel studied the projected timeline. Arbitration hearing in 2 days. Permit submission phase next week. Public announcement event scheduled in 3 weeks. If Arjun's structural concerns became public, that timeline would fracture. Insurance reviews, code audits, potential redesign, millions delayed, millions renegotiated. Rachel turned toward the desk. A printed email draft lay in a paper shred tray. Forensics halted the shredder and reconstructed partially intact fragments. One line became legible. Cannot allow regulatory panic before arbitration resolution. No signature visible. But context clear. In the garage, tire impressions were compared against casts from the warehouse yard. Preliminary visual match. Not definitive yet, but consistent in width and tread pattern. Upstairs, a closet drawer yielded something smaller. A pack of industrial, grade zip ties identical to those recovered in the warehouse. Common item. Yet timing transforms ordinary objects into connective tissue. Sethi remained composed throughout the search. He sat at the kitchen table, hands folded. When Rachel approached him again, she placed a photograph on the table. The image recovered from the warehouse laptop showing the overpass bracket with tool scoring. "This image was taken from a device registered to you," she said. He glanced at it. "I inspect assets under our development review. That is not unusual. It was copied onto Arjun Mehta's laptop at 11:14 last night." A pause, controlled but longer than before. "I cannot account for what junior analysts do with shared files." "It was not shared through official channels," Rachel replied. Silence. Then, "Detective, development negotiations are complex. Emotions run high. Engineers sometimes overstate concerns." "Did he overstate?" she asked quietly. Sethi did not answer. Because denial would require detail. Detail invites inconsistency. Rachel shifted. At 1:37 in the morning, Arjun received a call from a prepaid number. His device then traveled toward the warehouse adjacent to your contested parcel. "I do not own that warehouse," Sethi said. "You are contesting redevelopment rights for the parcel bordering it. That is a legal process." "Yes," Rachel said evenly. "And legal processes do not require zip ties." For the first time, something flickered. Not fear. Annoyance. "Detective, are you accusing me of something specific?" "I am evaluating why a structural analyst raising safety concerns was restrained in a building beside your development zone and positioned on a rail hours after you received a delay alert that disrupted train timing." The words settled between them. Measured, precise. Sethi leaned back slightly. "You are constructing a narrative." "No," Rachel replied. "I am dismantling one." Forensics signaled from the study. Device extraction revealed a deleted call log entry at 1:30. 5 in the morning from a secondary encrypted application. Number unregistered. Duration 1 minute and 9 seconds. Followed by location data movement toward the freight corridor. Rachel placed that information gently in front of him. You left home at 1:22, she said. Your device pinged near the warehouse at 1:49. A delay alert was opened at 1:42. A man you supervised was restrained nearby. At 1:57, an earlier train arrived. At 2 minutes past 2, he was dead. The kitchen felt smaller. Sethi's breathing remained steady, but his hands had tightened subtly against the table surface. I want my attorney, he said finally. Rachel nodded. That was expected. She left the residence while devices were cataloged. Outside, morning traffic hummed indifferently, but timing was tightening again. Back at the precinct, forensic results from the zip ties returned. Partial latent prints lifted from one tie matched. Not Sethi. Another individual. Unknown. Which meant he had not acted alone. Rachel revisited the surveillance footage from the warehouse yard. The dark sedan reversed into position at 1:51, but headlights briefly illuminated the driver's silhouette before the engine shut off. She enhanced the frame. The build was broader than Sethi, shoulders heavier, which aligned with the second shadow seen behind Arjun on the overpass camera. Sethi may have orchestrated, but someone else executed the physical restraint. Rachel checked corporate staffing under Sethi's project team. One name surfaced with relevant background. Raghav Bansal, former private security contractor, currently listed as risk assessment consultant. Employment began 3 months ago, just before redevelopment negotiations intensified. She pulled Bansal's phone records. At 1:34 in the morning, his device received a message from an encrypted application. At 1:36, his phone location shifted from his apartment. At 1:48, tower ping near warehouse. At 2 minutes past 2, movement eastbound, which meant coordination, not improvisation. The early train arrival forced acceleration, but the participants were already in place. Rachel authorized pickup of Raghav Bansal. He was detained mid-afternoon without incident. Unlike Sethi, Bansal did not maintain composure during questioning. Within the first hour, inconsistencies surfaced. He claimed he had been home. Location data contradicted. He claimed he had not entered the warehouse. Shoe tread pattern from the partial imprint on the overpass matched a boot brand found in his vehicle trunk. Under pressure, his breathing fractured. Who called you? Rachel asked quietly. Silence. Who told you the train was delayed? A longer silence. Then, barely audible, he said the timing changed. Who? Bansal stared at the table. Vikram. The first direct fracture. Rachel did not press immediately. Instead, she allowed the silence to expand. Because once hierarchy collapses downward, gravity does the rest. He said we couldn't wait. Bansal continued eventually. Said there were too many variables. Said the early train messed it up. Was the plan to wait for 2:16? Rachel asked. Yes. Why? So no one would hear. And if he resisted. Bansal swallowed. He didn't fight much. Just kept saying this was wrong. Rachel's jaw tightened slightly. Did you cut the zip tie? Yes. So he could walk up the stairs. Did he know why he was there? He figured it out. How? He saw the shoes in the car. Rachel paused. Shoes, pre-positioned, aligned for staging. Who placed them on the rail? She asked. Vikram. The admission settled like a final piece clicking into place. Because symbolism requires the architect. Execution requires the enforcer, and both had roles. Block 5 closes not with confession of motive, but with structure clarified. Arjun Mehta questioned the integrity of a rail. Vikram Sethi questioned the stability of a multimillion redevelopment. Raghav Bansal enforced silence when calculations became inconvenient. The train delay forced early action. Early action created shadow. Shadow created evidence. And evidence now points upward, not toward accident, not toward tragedy, but toward deliberate elimination timed against a freight schedule. The clock that once masked sound is now marking consequence. And consequence is no longer delayed. Confessions are rarely clean. They fragment under pressure. They omit motive while admitting action. Raghav Bansal had admitted to restraint, to escort, to presence on the overpass. But motive still sat one layer above him, and motive determines charge. Rachel re-entered the interrogation room just after 7 in the evening. Bansel's composure had deteriorated, shoulders rounded, hands restless. You said the early train messed it up. She began calmly. Explain that. Bansal exhaled slowly. The plan was simple, he said. Wait for the loud train. Push when no one could hear anything. Leave the shoes. Leave the schedule. Make it look like he jumped because he knew the train was coming. Why the schedule? Rachel asked. So it looked intentional, like he chose the timing. And the shoes aligned. That was Vikram's idea. Said symmetry makes people believe things. Rachel said nothing, because symmetry had nearly worked. Why not wait after the early train passed? She continued. Bansal shook his head, because Vikram got the alert. He said the 2:16 was delayed, said we couldn't risk sitting up there too long. Someone might drive by, might see. Arjun aware of the delay? Rachel asked. No. Did you tell him? No. Rachel let the silence stretch. Why did Vikram need Arjun gone? She asked finally. Bansal's eyes flickered upward briefly. He said Arjun was going to file something. Something that would freeze everything. What exactly? Structural failure claim. Said if that hit the safety board before arbitration, investors would panic. Said the rail corridor would get flagged for inspection. Said we'd lose months, maybe years. So the solution was to eliminate the engineer. Rachel's tone remained flat. Bansal swallowed. He said it wasn't personal. Said it was about protecting the project. Projects do not bleed. People do. Rachel leaned forward slightly. Did Arjun threaten you? She asked.
No.
Did he attack you? No. Did he attempt to jump on his own? Bansal shook his head slowly. No. That mattered, because premeditation had now solidified into narrative form. Planned staging, planted evidence, calculated timing, interrupted execution. Rachel stepped out of the room and contacted the prosecutor's office. Charges would escalate. Conspiracy, kidnapping, murder. Back in her office, she reviewed Sethi's device extraction results. Encrypted messaging logs recovered through forensic carve out revealed deleted exchanges between Sethi and Bansal earlier that evening. Key phrases surfaced. 2:16 ideal. If delay, we adjust. Noise cover critical. Clean and controlled. One final message timestamped at 1:44 in the morning. Early freight passed at 57. Push before next visibility spike. Rachel read it twice. Visibility spike. He was not just thinking about sound. He was thinking about illumination. The early train's headlights would expose silhouettes longer than expected, which meant waiting could increase risk of identification by passing motorists or security cameras. So he compressed the timeline, and compression created the second shadow captured on video. She closed the message window and stared at the board quietly. Arjun had not died because of structural weakness. He died because he understood structural weakness. He saw torque irregularities. He prepared to escalate, and escalation threatened arbitration leverage. Rachel returned to Sethi for a second interview. His attorney was present now. Immaculate posture restored. But data does not argue emotionally. It accumulates. We recovered deleted messages, Rachel said calmly. You referenced the 2:16 timing. You referenced adjustment if delayed. You instructed Bansal to push early. Sethi's attorney interjected immediately. My client disputes the interpretation of those phrases. Rachel slid the printed thread across the table. Push before next visibility spike. Silence. Measured. Sethi's eyes moved across the page. For the first time, his composure fractured. Not outwardly dramatic, but internally recalibrating. You believed Arjun's report would jeopardize arbitration. Rachel continued. You believed delay would reduce leverage. You believed a suicide narrative would protect valuation. My client does not concede any such belief, the attorney said. Rachel did not respond to the attorney. Instead, she addressed Sethi directly. You photographed the bracket earlier this week. You were aware of torque irregularities. You knew Arjun was escalating. You placed the shoes yourself. A pause. Then Sethi spoke. You have no recording of that. No. Rachel replied. But your co-conspirator does. Silence. Because hierarchy collapses when loyalty becomes liability. You calculated noise cover. You calculated lighting exposure. You calculated optics, Rachel said quietly. But you miscalculated the first train. The words landed heavier than accusation. They identified error. And for someone like Sethi, error was intolerable. He inhaled slowly. You do not understand development politics, he said at last. I understand timing, Rachel replied. And timing is everything. He looked at her then, not defiant. Analytical, as if evaluating whether the calculus still favored denial. But numbers had turned. Forensic matches between his garage vehicle and warehouse tire casts came back conclusive that evening. Zip tie packaging from his home bore batch numbers identical to ties recovered on site. The overpass bracket image metadata matched his corporate device uniquely. The silhouette on the rail showed shoulder width inconsistent with Arjon and consistent with Bansal, and digital logs placed Sethi in the corridor at the critical window. Layer upon layer. Not theatrical. Not dramatic. Just precise. Like the plan had been. Except the plan assumed total control over environment. It assumed trains run exactly on schedule. It assumed silence would erase sound. It assumed symmetry would erase suspicion. But systems contain variables. Mechanical delays, unexpected light angles, human hesitation, and those variables unravel perfection. Rachel stepped outside the precinct close to midnight. The city was quieter now. Another freight train passed faintly in the distance. She thought about Arjun standing on that rail, hands recently unbound, understanding what was about to happen, understanding that the schedule highlighted in yellow was not his choice. He had analyzed load, bearing structures. He had trusted calculations, but he had underestimated how far someone would go to preserve financial architecture. Block 6 closes with motive crystallized. This was not rage, not jealousy, not personal vendetta. It was strategic elimination disguised as despair, a murder timed against a freight schedule, a death calculated in decibels and headlights, and the only flaw in the equation was a train that arrived too soon. Which means the clock that once protected them is now counting down toward indictment. Because when planning becomes choreography, interruption becomes evidence. And evidence does not forget timing. Indictments move slower than trains. But once in motion, they do not reverse. By late morning, formal charges were filed against Vikram Sethi and Raghav Bansal. Conspiracy to commit kidnapping, first-degree murder, tampering with evidence, staging of a death scene. But Rachel Monroe did not close the board, because something still pressed against the edges of the timeline. Not doubt, but completion. She returned once more to Arjun Mehta's apartment. Not to search, to understand. His drafting table remained as it had been left. Engineering textbooks open to structural load chapters. Torque calculation sheets annotated in the margins. He had been methodical, deliberate, careful with variables. On his desk, beneath a stack of compliance guidelines, Rachel found a small notebook. Not work issued. Personal. Inside were handwritten entries spanning the past 3 weeks. Notes about bracket torque irregularities. Notes about maintenance crews that were not listed in official logs. And one entry dated 3 nights ago, vs. dismissive about microfractures. Says arbitration first, adjustments later. Feels wrong. vs. Rachel closed the notebook gently. He had recognized the pressure. He had sensed the prioritization of optics over safety. She flipped further. An entry from 2 nights ago. If report suppressed internally, escalate externally. Cannot ignore. And beneath that, a final line. If something happens, this is not accident. Rachel stood still for a long moment. Because Arjun had anticipated resistance. Perhaps not violence, but suppression. She photographed the notebook and secured it. Back at the precinct, prosecutors began preparing for arraignment. Media requests flooded in. The initial narrative of a tragic suicide had already begun circulating in early morning reports before the homicide classification was announced. Correction would follow. But first impressions linger. Symmetry nearly succeeded. Rachel requested release of limited surveillance stills showing the second shadow on the overpass. Not to sensationalize. To correct. Because truth must displace narrative before narrative calcifies. That afternoon, she visited the Freight Authority again. This time not for delay logs, for maintenance records. Under deeper review, an anomaly surfaced. 2 weeks prior, a private contractor accessed the overpass under a redevelopment pre-inspection permit. Signed authorization from Vikram Sethi. Work order described as visual inspection only. But torque readings from municipal baseline logs showed deviation following that visit. Someone had physically altered bracket tension before Arjun documented it, which meant the structural vulnerability may have been engineered, not accidental. Rachel leaned back in the operations chair. If the bracket had failed naturally under increased load during redevelopment, liability could shift to municipal oversight rather than private development. Controlled weakening creates plausible future collapse. And if Arjun exposed tampering, that plan would fracture. Silencing him removed both whistleblower and technical proof. Except for the image Sethi captured himself, arrogance often leaves residue. Rachel returned to interrogation transcripts. Bansal had described the moment on the rail. He didn't beg. He had said quietly. What did he say? Rachel had asked. He said, "You don't fix a structure by hiding cracks." Rachel stared at the words now typed in black ink. You don't fix a structure by hiding cracks. Arjun had been speaking about the overpass. But he could have been speaking about the entire development, about the arbitration, about corporate ethics, about systems that reward concealment. She closed the file. That night, she drove once more to the overpass. Not because evidence remained, but because resolution sometimes requires physical stillness. Traffic flowed normally. Pedestrians crossed without noticing the history embedded in metal. The guardrail bracket, now marked for forensic replacement, bore faint discoloration where tools had scored bolts. The rail had not failed, but trust in it had. Rachel placed her hand against the metal again. Solid. Stable. But only because the plan to weaken it had been interrupted by exposure. A freight train approached beneath. Headlights cutting through dusk. She watched as it passed at full volume. Imagine 2:16. Imagine shoes aligned. Imagine morning headlines. Young engineer jumps before train. Questions about mental health. Quiet speculation. No corporate scandal. No arbitration delay. Clean. But clean is rarely true. Clean is curated. And curated narratives depend on silence. The early train at 1:57 broke silence. It forced acceleration. It exposed a second shadow. It captured a shape behind a man who was not meant to be seen. Rachel stepped back from the rail. She thought about hierarchy. About how Vikram Sethi had believed he could manage variables like spreadsheets. Sound levels, lighting exposure, human compliance. He believed risk could be mitigated through elimination. But risk is not removed by force. It mutates. It leaves digital residue. It leaves torque irregularities. It leaves message threads. It leaves co-conspirators who fracture under interrogation. And it leaves cameras that record more than intended. Block 7 closes with structure restored, not to the overpass, to the case. Arjun Mehta did not jump. He escalated concern. He identified cracks. He refused to suppress findings. And for that, he was positioned on a rail calculated to erase him. But the clock misaligned. A freight train arrived too soon. Headlights stretched shadows longer than expected. And those shadows are now evidence. Because when someone believes timing is everything, they forget that timing is rarely theirs alone. Trains run late, lights shift, people speak, and structures, whether steel or corporate, fail when cracks are ignored. The overpass remains standing, but the architecture of deception has collapsed, and unlike trains, indictments do not delay. Indictment is not conclusion. It is exposure. Within 48 hours of the charges, financial analysts began revisiting the Eastern Freight Corridor redevelopment package. Investors asked quiet questions. Insurance carriers paused preliminary underwriting. The arbitration hearing, scheduled for tomorrow morning, was formally postponed. Timing had shifted again, but this time not in Vikram Sethi's favor. Rachel Monroe sat in the courtroom gallery during the brief procedural appearance. Sethi stood composed beside his attorney. Bansal stood several feet away, shoulders no longer squared. Two men who once operated within hierarchy now separated by strategy. When the judge read the charges aloud, Sethi's expression did not fracture. But composure is not absolution. Outside, cameras waited. Reporters asked about corruption, about infrastructure, about public safety. Rachel did not speak publicly. Her work was not performance. It was reconstruction. Back at the precinct, prosecutors prepared the evidentiary chain, digital messages, location pings, warehouse laptop, overpass bracket image metadata, zip tie batch match, tire cast alignment, surveillance shadow, Bansel's statement, Arjun's notebook, and one more element, subtle but decisive. Rail Authority internal logs confirmed that the 216 freight was delayed due to an unscheduled brake temperature alert at the prior junction. The alert was generated by automated system diagnostics, no human manipulation, no conspiracy within rail control, pure mechanical variance. That variance destroyed the precision of Sethi's timing. Rachel studied the delay report again. Brake temperature spike detected at 133. Inspection completed at 141. Departure resumed at 143. Revised arrival projected at 216. If the system had not triggered the inspection, the 216 would have passed precisely as scheduled. The staging might have aligned perfectly. Silence might have swallowed the fall. The shadow might have been less distinct under predictable lighting. The truck driver might have arrived later. Discovery might have occurred under a narrative too tidy to question. Mechanical variance. A brake temperature sensor. A fraction of unpredictability inside a system engineered for schedule. Rachel leaned back in her chair. Sethi had built his plan on precision. He accounted for human silence. He accounted for noise cover. He accounted for optics. He did not account for mechanical randomness, which meant the case hinged not on brilliance of investigation alone, but on interruption. She returned to Arjun's final notebook entry. If something happens, this is not accident. The words were simple, but legally potent, because they reflected fear of suppression. And suppression had been documented through deleted messages and corporate pressure. Rachel authorized forensic replication of the overpass bracket torque pattern. Independent engineers simulated loosening to the exact degree measured 2 weeks ago. Under moderate lateral force, failure probability increased. Not guaranteed, but increased, which meant Sethi's plan may have extended beyond staging suicide. It may have included long-term structural compromise to leverage future redevelopment funding. Weaken, expose, profit. But exposure arrived early. In interrogation follow-up, Bansal admitted something further. He said if the rail ever failed during inspection, it would prove the city neglected maintenance, Bansal had stated. Said either way, we win. Rachel wrote that line on the board. Either way, we win. Except they did not. Because they underestimated documentation. Arjun documented. He photographed irregularities. He drafted escalation. He kept notes. He left residue of awareness. And Sethi left residue of arrogance. That evening, Rachel received final forensic confirmation. Latent fiber recovered from the warehouse support column matched fabric from Bansal's jacket seized during arrest. The chain was now airtight. She walked once more through the overpass case file in full sequence. Warehouse access permit authorized by Sethi. Bracket torque alteration documented by Arjun. Image captured by Sethi's device. Delay notification received. Encrypted messages coordinating adjustment. Prepaid call luring Arjun. Restraint. Escort. Early train arrival. Accelerated push. Shoes aligned. Schedule planted. Emergency call. Digital flight. Mechanical variance disrupting perfection. Each step aligned. But perfection requires all variables. And no one controls all variables. Night fell again. Rachel drove to the overpass one final time before submitting the completed investigative report. The city skyline shimmered faintly beyond the rail corridor. A freight train approached. On time. She watched its headlights grow brighter, watched shadows stretch along the concrete slope, watched vibration ripple through metal, then pass. Silence returning in stages. She imagined how close the plan had come to succeeding, how thin the margin had been between staged narrative and exposed conspiracy, how easily public perception bends toward symmetry. Shoes aligned, schedule highlighted, young engineer alone on a rail. But truth rarely aligns perfectly. It leaves seams. It leaves timing errors. It leaves brake temperature alerts that no one planned. Rachel stepped back from the guardrail. The overpass would remain. Reinforced properly now. Inspected thoroughly. Arjun's report would be entered into municipal review formally. His findings no longer suppressed. Block 8 closes with inevitability solidifying. The system Sethi tried to manipulate has now turned procedural and slow. Court dates, filings, testimony. No dramatic reversal. No sudden confession. Just steady consequence. He built his plan around decibels and headlights, but he forgot about sensors and data logs. He forgot about engineers who write things down. He forgot that interruption is not anomaly. It is constant. And in this case, interruption was justice arriving 7 minutes early. Trials are not about what happened. They are about what can be proven. 6 months after Arjun Mehta fell from the overpass, the courtroom filled with experts, analysts, reporters, and investors who once debated land value in quiet conference rooms. Now they debated intent. The prosecution began not with emotion, but with sequence. Warehouse access authorization, torque alteration, escalation draft, encrypted coordination, delay notification, premature push, symmetry as staging. Rachel Monroe sat behind the prosecution table, not as narrator, but as witness to structure, because this case was architecture. Not passion, not chaos. Architecture. When Arjun's notebook was introduced into evidence, the courtroom shifted subtly. If something happens, this is not accident. The defense objected to speculation. The judge overruled, because context matters when motive is contested. Rail authority engineers testified next. They explained brake temperature sensors, automated delay triggers, revised scheduling. One engineer described how the early freight at 1:57 had arrived on time, but ahead of the intended 2:16 masking train. Variance is inherent in mechanical systems, he said calmly. That sentence carried weight. Variance is inherent. No system is perfectly predictable. The prosecution then introduced the surveillance still, the second shadow behind Arjun on the rail, enlarged, clarified. Not dramatic, just undeniable. The defense attempted to argue that shadows distort proportion, but tire casts did not distort. Zip tie batch matches did not distort. Encrypted message logs did not distort, and Bansal under oath did not distort. He described the warehouse restraint, the stairwell ascent, the moment Sethi adjusted the shoes on the rail, the message, push before next visibility spike. The courtroom was silent. Not because of spectacle, because of calculation. Sethi did not testify. His defense focused on doubt, on interpretation, on arguing that discussions of timing referred to project scheduling, not homicide. But message context, layered with location data, collapsed ambiguity. Rachel was called to the stand on the third day. The prosecutor asked her to explain why the early train mattered. She answered without dramatics. The plan depended on synchronizing the fall with peak freight noise at 2:16, she said. The earlier train at 1:57 forced acceleration. That acceleration exposed a second silhouette and compressed departure timing. Without the delay variance, staging would have aligned more cleanly. Are you suggesting a mechanical delay prevented a perfect crime? The defense attorney asked. I am suggesting, Rachel replied evenly, that unpredictable systems disrupt controlled narratives. No further commentary, because simplicity persuades. The bracket torque evidence followed. Independent engineers demonstrated how non-uniform tightening altered stress distribution. Not enough to guarantee failure immediately, but enough to raise legitimate safety flags, and Arjun had raised them. The motive crystallized in financial testimony. Investment analysts confirmed arbitration outcomes would have shifted dramatically if structural integrity concerns became public before hearing. Insurance underwriters testified that safety alerts freeze capital flows. Delays cost millions. Millions create pressure. Pressure creates decisions. On the final day of testimony, the prosecution replayed the encrypted message thread. 2:16 ideal. If delay adjust. Push before next visibility spike. Then the delay log. Brake temperature spike detected at 1:33. Inspection completed at 1:41. Revised arrival 2:16. Mechanical variance. The defense offered no alternative narrative for why Arjun's phone moved to the warehouse, why zip ties matched Bansal's supply, why Sethi's device photographed the bracket days prior, why delay timing triggered encrypted coordination. They offered doubt, but doubt requires fracture. And the structure held. The jury deliberated for 9 hours. At dusk, the verdict was read. Guilty on all major counts. Sethi's composure finally faltered. Not dramatically, but subtly. The architecture he trusted had failed. Because architecture built on concealment cannot survive exposure. Bansal received a reduced sentence for cooperation. Sethi received life imprisonment without parole. No applause followed, no visible celebration, just procedure. Rachel left the courthouse quietly. Outside, the city moved as it always had. Freight trains continued their schedules. Brake sensors continued monitoring heat. Arbitration proceedings resumed months later under new oversight. The overpass was retrofitted properly. Guardrails reinforced. Inspection logs audited independently. Arjun's final report was published in full by the Municipal Safety Board. His name credited, not as a victim, as the analyst who identified torque irregularities before they became catastrophe. Rachel returned one final time to the overpass at night. The rail gleamed under new fittings. Bolts uniform. Torque verified. Another freight train approached. Not early, not late. On schedule. Headlights carved across the concrete slope. No shadow stood behind the rail this time. No shoes aligned. No schedule highlighted. Just steel and motion. She thought about how close the plan had come to succeeding. How a difference of minutes reshaped consequence. How a brake temperature sensor, indifferent and automatic, introduced variance that human calculation did not anticipate. The system functioned imperfectly, and imperfection created truth. Block 9 closes with accountability rendered, not through dramatic revelation, but through accumulation of timing errors, digital residue, mechanical variance, and documentation left by an engineer who refused to ignore cracks. Arjun meta-analyzed structures. Vikram Sethi tried to manipulate one, but he built his plan on certainty, and certainty does not exist in moving systems. Trains shift, lights change. People write things down, and when timing misaligns, the shadow behind the rail becomes visible. Not as accident, but as intent. One block remains, and it will not be about guilt. It will be about what remains after precision collapses. Closure is not silence. It is correction. 3 months after sentencing, the Eastern Freight Overpass reopened fully under revised municipal certification. Reinforced brackets. Verified torque patterns. Independent audit oversight. Arjun Mehta's name was engraved on a small, unobtrusive plaque installed near the pedestrian access stairwell. Not grand. Not ceremonial. Just factual. In recognition of structural diligence. Rachel Monroe stood several feet away from it at dusk. No reporters this time. No courtrooms. No surveillance screens replaying shadows. Just steel, vibration, and memory. The overpass no longer carried the same tension. The bolts were uniform. The guardrail steady. The microfractures Arjun documented had been addressed properly, not concealed. A freight train approached beneath. Headlights swept across the slope where his body had once lain. The noise rose and passed. No one paused, no one flinched. Because this time, the structure held not through staging, but through correction. Rachel reviewed the case file one last time earlier that afternoon before submitting it to archive. Warehouse restraint. Encrypted coordination. Mechanical delay. Accelerated push. Symmetry as deception. Variance as exposure. Each piece now filed not as mystery, but as record. But there was one final detail that had stayed with her. Not evidentiary, but philosophical. During sentencing, the judge had addressed Vikram Sethi directly. You treated human life as a variable. The judge said, you assumed systems could be manipulated to conceal intent. But systems are larger than individuals. Rachel had written that line down, because it was true beyond this case. Sethi believed timing was controllable. He believed sound could erase violence. He believed light angles could conceal silhouettes. He believed documentation could be suppressed. He believed a death could be reframed through symmetry. He underestimated variance. Brake temperature sensors. Independent engineers. Encrypted data recovery. Co-conspirator fracture. An analyst who wrote things down. Variance does not guarantee justice. But in this case, it created opportunity. Opportunity allowed investigation. Investigation dismantled choreography. And choreography, once disrupted, collapses under its own precision. Rachel looked again at the rail. At the midpoint where two figures had once stood. At the angle where shoes had been aligned heel to heel. At the spot where a schedule had been highlighted in yellow to fabricate intent. The narrative nearly worked. Young engineer. Late night. Freight timing. Tragic choice. Clean. But clean is constructed. Truth is layered. And layers require patience to uncover. She stepped back and watched another train pass, on schedule. Lights sweeping. Sound rolling through metal. The same conditions that were meant to conceal had now become routine background again. No symbolism, no choreography, just transit. Before leaving, she paused at the plaque once more. Arjun had written, "You don't fix a structure by hiding cracks." The phrase applied beyond steel. It applied to corporations, to arbitration processes, to redevelopment deals built on leveraged silence. It applied to systems that prioritize valuation over integrity. And it applied to investigations. Because hiding cracks in a case, ignoring inconsistencies for convenience, produces collapse later. She turned toward the stairwell. Metal steps solid beneath her boots. No mud trails now. No zip ties scattered on concrete. No warehouse door ajar in shadow. That building had since been secured under municipal order. Ownership review ongoing. The redevelopment project transferred to a different firm under strict compliance oversight. Investors recalculated projections. Safety audits embedded into contract language. Arjun's findings now permanently attached to the site's regulatory file. His documentation prevented not just concealment, but potential future failure. That mattered. Because sometimes justice is not only about punishment, it is about prevention. Rachel reached her vehicle and paused before opening the door. She thought again about the early train at 1:57. If it had not arrived on schedule, if the brake sensor had not triggered at 1:33, if the delay had not shifted visibility calculations, if silence had swallowed impact, the case might have remained classified as self-inflicted tragedy. Sethi might have continued arbitration, the overpass might have been weakened further, and Arjun's notes might have disappeared. 7 minutes. That was the margin between concealment and consequence. 7 minutes introduced by mechanical variance. 7 minutes that created a second shadow visible on camera. 7 minutes that forced acceleration and exposed hierarchy. 7 minutes that proved precision is illusion. She started the engine. In the distance, the rail corridor hummed. Life resumed its rhythm. Episode 18 does not end with spectacle. It ends with structure. Arjun Mehta identified cracks. Vikram Sethi tried to bury them beneath noise. Raghav Bansal enforced silence under instruction, but silence fractured under interruption. And interruption revealed design. If you followed this case from the first call at 3 minutes past 2, you now know what timing concealed and what variance revealed. Because the lesson was never about trains. It was about control. About the arrogance of believing systems bend entirely to will. They do not. They shift. They delay. They misalign. And in those misalignments, truth becomes visible. The overpass stands. The bracket holds. The plaque remains small but permanent. And the clock that once marked an attempted erasure now marks something else. Documentation outlives choreography. Cracks exposed are stronger than cracks concealed. And precision without integrity always collapses under the weight of variance. If this case stayed with you, subscribe for more investigations where every detail counts. And in the comments, tell me, what was the moment you knew something didn't add up?